The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the velvet ropes, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Jake Morrison, a United States Marine on leave in London, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. His broad shoulders and sharp eyes betrayed years of military discipline, even as he tried to blend in with the other sightseers. Jake had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. His chest bore scars from shrapnel, and his left hand trembled slightly from nerve damage sustained during a roadside bombing that had claimed 2 of his closest friends. The trauma followed him everywhere, manifesting in sleepless nights and sudden flashbacks that could strike without warning. This vacation to London was supposed to be therapeutic, a chance to clear his mind and find some peace away from the memories that haunted him. As the crimson-clad royal guards marched into position, their bearskin hats towering above their heads and their faces stoic beneath the black chin straps, Jake found himself studying their movements. There was something familiar in their precision, their unwavering focus, their complete dedication to duty. It reminded him of his own brothers in arms, the Marines who had stood beside him in the desert heat and mountain cold of distant battlefields. The crowd pressed closer, smartphones held high as the ceremony began. Children squealed with delight, pointing at the guards' elaborate uniforms, while adults whispered about the tradition and pageantry. Jake remained silent, his trained eye noting details others missed. The way the guards maintained perfect spacing despite the chaos around them, how their eyes never stopped scanning for threats even during this tourist spectacle, the subtle communication that passed between them with barely perceptible nods and glances. Standing at attention in the front rank was Sergeant William Hartwell of the Coldstream Guards, a man whose military career had been built on unwavering dedication to the crown. At 28, he had served for 8 years, rising through the ranks through sheer determination and an almost obsessive attention to detail. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to a mirror shine, every crease razor sharp. The weight of his bearskin hat, the stiffness of his red tunic, the perfect alignment of his boots, these were not burdens, but sources of pride. William's father had served in the same regiment, as had his grandfather before him. Military service was not just a career in the Hartwell family, it was a calling, a sacred trust passed down through generations. From the time he could walk, William had been taught that duty came before self, that honor was worth more than comfort, and that the uniform he wore represented something far greater than any individual. The ceremony proceeded with clockwork precision. Commands rang out in crisp British accents, and the guards moved as one organism, their rifles shouldered in perfect unison, their steps measured and deliberate. For 20 minutes, they performed the ancient ritual that had been repeated countless times over centuries, a living link to Britain's military heritage. As the crowd began to disperse, most visitors satisfied with their photos and ready to move on to the next tourist attraction, Jake lingered. Something about the guards' bearing, their obvious professionalism, had stirred memories both painful and proud. He thought of his fallen comrades, of the flag-draped coffins he had helped carry, of the weight of responsibility that every soldier bears. William, still at attention but aware of his surroundings, noticed the American who hadn't moved. There was something different about this tourist, something in his posture and the way his eyes tracked movement that suggested military training. As a professional soldier, William had developed an instinct for recognizing his own kind, and everything about this stranger screamed veteran. The moment stretched between them, unacknowledged but real. 2 warriors from different nations, different traditions, but bound by the common experience of service, of sacrifice, of carrying a burden that civilians could never fully understand. Neither moved, neither spoke, But in that silent moment, a connection began to form that would soon capture the attention of everyone present. Jake's flashback hit without warning. The sound of a tourist's camera clicking became the sharp crack of rifle fire. The red of the guards' uniforms transformed into the crimson of blood on sand. The crowd's chatter faded into the ringing silence that followed explosions. For a moment that felt like eternity. Jake was back in Helmand Province, watching his friend Marcus die in his arms, feeling helpless despite all his training, all his strength. When the episode passed, as they always did, Jake found himself rigid with tension, his breathing shallow, his hands clenched into fists. The familiar shame washed over him, the feeling that he should be stronger, that a Marine should be able to control such reactions. He began to turn away, ready to retreat to the anonymity of London's busy streets, when he noticed that one of the guards was watching him with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. William had witnessed the moment when the American's composure cracked. He recognized the signs immediately, the 1,000-yard stare, the sudden tension, the way the man's breathing changed. As someone who had lost friends in Northern Ireland early in his career and had seen combat stress in many forms, William understood what he was witnessing. This was a fellow soldier in pain, and military brotherhood transcended national boundaries. For the first time in his career, William felt the urge to break protocol. Every fiber of his training screamed against it. A royal guard on duty did not move, did not speak, did not acknowledge distractions. But this was different. This was about something more fundamental than ceremony or tradition. This was about one warrior recognizing another's struggle and feeling compelled to help. The conflict played out behind William's expressionless face as he maintained his position. Duty warred with compassion, training with instinct. The weight of his responsibility to the crown pressed against the equally heavy weight of his responsibility to a brother in arms who was clearly suffering. Around them, the normal bustle of tourist London continued. Vendors sold postcards and miniature Union Jacks, tour guides led groups of visitors toward Westminster Abbey, and the changing of the guard ceremony concluded with its usual pomp and efficiency. But in the space between two soldiers, time seemed suspended, pregnant with possibility and the recognition that some moments transcend routine and demand courage of a different kind. Jake's rational mind told him to leave, to find a quiet place to recover and pretend this episode hadn't happened. But something in the guard's steady gaze held him in place, offering an anchor in the storm of his memories. For the first time since arriving in London, Jake felt less alone with his demons. The crowd began to thin, but neither man moved from their positions. A silent conversation was taking place, conducted entirely through subtle shifts in posture and the language of shared experience. Both understood that something significant was happening, though neither could predict where it would lead. As the last of the ceremony concluded, and most tourists wandered away to their next destination, William faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Everything he had been taught said he should remain at his post, maintain the dignity and tradition of his position, and ignore all distractions. But everything he had learned as a human being, everything that made him more than just a uniform and a weapon, told him that some moments demanded action, regardless of the consequences. The stage was set for a confrontation between duty and humanity, between the rigid requirements of military protocol and the unwritten laws that bind soldiers together across all boundaries. In the heart of London, watched by scattered tourists and security cameras, two warriors stood on the edge of a moment that would test everything they believed about honor, service, and the true meaning of courage. The decision came to William like a lightning bolt, sudden and undeniable. In 8 years of service, he had never once broken protocol during a public ceremony. His record was spotless, his dedication absolute. But as he watched the American veteran struggle with invisible demons, William realized that some things mattered more than regulations. Without warning, William stepped forward from his position. The movement was so unexpected, so completely against protocol, that the few remaining tourists immediately took notice. A royal guard simply did not move during ceremony, did not break formation, did not acknowledge the public. The breach of tradition was so shocking that people began pulling out their phones again, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Jake looked up in surprise as the tall guard approached him, the red tunic and bearskin hat suddenly much more imposing up close. For a moment, confusion replaced the lingering effects of his flashback. This wasn't supposed to happen. Palace guards were famous for their stoic immobility, their complete indifference to everything around them. Yet here was one walking directly toward him with obvious purpose. "Are you all right, mate?" William's voice was quiet but firm, pitched low enough that only Jake could hear. The British accent was crisp and professional, but there was genuine concern beneath the formality. "I recognize the signs. Combat veteran?" Jake stared at the guard, stunned by the unexpected question. The man's face was serious but kind, and his eyes held the same shadows that Jake saw in his own mirror every morning. There was an immediate recognition between them, the instant understanding that passes between people who have seen similar horrors and carried similar burdens. "Marine," Jake replied simply, his voice rough with emotion. 3 tours Afghanistan, 1 Iraq. He paused, studying William's face. "You?" "Coldstream Guards. Did my time in Northern Ireland, then Afghanistan." William glanced around quickly, noting the growing attention from nearby tourists, but his focus remained on Jake. "PTSD?" The directness of the question caught Jake off guard. In America, mental health was still often treated as a weakness in military circles, something to be hidden or minimized. But this British soldier asked, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who understood that psychological wounds were as real and significant as physical ones. "Yeah," Jake admitted, the word feeling both heavy and liberating. "Some days are better than others." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a royal guard engaging in conversation with a tourist. Camera phones appeared, and voices began murmuring in multiple languages. Tour guides paused their scripts, unsure how to explain what they were witnessing. This simply didn't happen. The Queen's Guard maintained their posts like statues, indifferent to rain, snow, crowds, or any form of distraction. Security personnel noticed the deviation as well. Through earpieces and subtle hand signals, word began to spread through the palace security network that one of the guards had broken protocol. Supervisors started moving toward the scene, their expressions grim. Breaking formation during a public ceremony was a serious offense, one that could end a military career. William was acutely aware of the attention they were drawing and the trouble he was creating for himself, but he pressed on. Something about Jake's struggle resonated with his own experiences, his own difficult nights when sleep brought nightmares and waking brought the weight of memories. "Listen," he said urgently. "I know we've just met, but I've been where you are. The flashbacks, the guilt, the feeling like you should be stronger than this. You're not alone in it." Jake felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. For months, he had been isolating himself, convinced that his struggles marked him as weak or broken. His family tried to understand, but they hadn't been there, hadn't seen what he had seen. Fellow veterans in his unit were dealing with their own issues, and the last thing he wanted was to burden them with his problems. This stranger's simple acknowledgement of his pain felt like the first real human connection he had made since returning from his last deployment. "Why are you doing this?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the growing crowd of onlookers. "You're going to get in trouble." William's smile was grim but determined. "Because 8 years ago, I was standing in a mess tent in Kabul having a breakdown, and a Navy SEAL from your country sat with me until I could function again. Never even got his name, but he probably saved my career, maybe my life. Sometimes we have to risk the rules to do what's right." The crowd continued to grow. What had started as a handful of curious tourists had swelled to nearly 50 people, all craning their necks to see the unprecedented interaction between a royal guard and an American visitor. Social media began lighting up with photos and videos, hashtags already spreading across Twitter and Instagram. Breaking protocol and Royal Guard compassion began trending as the images spread globally. Palace security was now moving with greater urgency. Two supervisors approached from different directions, their faces stern and their intentions clear. William would be removed from his post immediately, and there would be serious consequences to follow. His military career, built over 8 painstaking years, was about to come under severe scrutiny. "They're coming for you," Jake observed, noting the approaching officials. "You should get back to your position. I'll be fine." But William didn't move. Instead, he did something even more shocking than his initial break from protocol. He removed his bearskin hat, holding it under his arm in a gesture of complete informality. The action sent gasps through the crowd and would undoubtedly make headlines around the world. A royal guard removing his ceremonial headgear in public was virtually unthinkable. "No," William said firmly. "Some things matter more than protocol. You matter more than my career." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. This stranger, this foreign soldier bound by traditions Jake barely understood, was willing to sacrifice everything he had worked for simply to offer comfort to another veteran in distress. The gesture was so profound, so unexpected, that Jake felt tears threatening for the first time since his discharge from the hospital. Around them, the crowd had grown completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a breach of military protocol. Even children stopped their chatter, somehow understanding that the adults around them were watching something important, something that transcended tourism and ceremony. The first security supervisor reached them. A stern-faced man in a dark suit whose expression left no doubt about his displeasure. "Sergeant Hartwell," he said in clipped tones, "return to your position immediately. This breach of protocol is completely unacceptable." William turned to face his superior, still holding his bearskin hat under his arm. His voice was respectful, but unwavering. "Sir, with all due respect, I cannot do that. This Marine is experiencing a medical emergency, and I have a duty to assist a fellow serviceman." "This is not a medical emergency," the supervisor replied coldly. "This is a tourist interaction, and it is completely against regulations. You will return to your post immediately, or you will be relieved of duty." Jake stepped forward, finally finding his voice. "Actually, sir, it was a medical emergency. I was having a panic attack, a PTSD episode. Your soldier here recognized the signs and intervened. In my country, we'd consider that exemplary behavior." The supervisor's expression didn't change, but Jake's words had carried to the crowd, which began murmuring approval. Several people called out in support of William's actions, and the mood in the courtyard shifted noticeably. What had started as curiosity about a protocol breach was evolving into something more complex, a public debate about the value of human compassion versus institutional rules. A second supervisor arrived, then a third. The situation was escalating beyond a simple disciplinary matter. Media crews from local news stations began arriving, drawn by the social media buzz and the unprecedented nature of the story. A royal guard breaking protocol to help an American veteran was exactly the kind of human interest story that would dominate headlines. William remained calm despite the growing storm around him. His training had prepared him for many situations, but nothing quite like this. Yet, as he looked at Jake, saw the gratitude and understanding in the Marine's eyes, he felt no regret. Some decisions transcended career considerations, and this was one of them. "Sergeant Hartwell," the senior supervisor said, his voice carrying the weight of final authority. "You have 30 seconds to return to your position, or you will be arrested and charged with dereliction of duty." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. William's military career, his family's proud tradition, his entire future hung in the balance. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness either a capitulation or a stand that would define both men's character for the rest of their lives. The 30 seconds stretched like an eternity. William stood motionless, his bearskin hat still tucked under his arm, facing the most crucial decision of his life. Around him, the crowd seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Phones continued recording, but the usual tourist chatter had died to complete silence. Even London's traffic seemed muted, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Jake watched the internal struggle play out across William's face and felt a crushing weight of guilt. This good man was about to destroy his career because of him, because of his weakness, because he couldn't handle his own demons without dragging others down. The Marine in him rebelled against being the cause of another soldier's downfall. "Don't do this," Jake said quietly, stepping closer to William. "I'm okay now. Really. Go back to your post. I'm not worth ruining your career over." William's eyes met Jake's with a steadiness that spoke of unshakable resolve. "You are," he said simply. "Every soldier who served, who sacrificed, who struggled with what we've seen and done, you're all worth it. I won't abandon a brother in arms to protect my career." The senior supervisor's face darkened with anger at what he clearly saw as insubordination of the highest order. Military discipline was built on absolute obedience to authority, and this public defiance was unacceptable. "Very well, Sergeant. You are hereby relieved of duty. Palace security will escort you from the premises." But as two security officers stepped forward to carry out the order, something unexpected happened. From the crowd, a voice called out, "Leave him alone!" It was an elderly man wearing a military cap, clearly a veteran himself. "The lad's doing the right thing." The single voice seemed to break a dam. More voices joined in, first a trickle, then a flood of support. "He's helping a fellow soldier," someone shouted. "This is what honor looks like," called another. The crowd that had gathered to watch a tourist attraction had become something else entirely, a jury of public opinion that was rendering its verdict in real time. Among the voices were other veterans, recognizable by their bearing and their passionate defense of William's actions. An older woman stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of experience. "My son served in Iraq. He came home broken, just like this young American. If someone had shown him this kind of compassion, he might still be alive today." The words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Here was not just a story about military protocol, but about human decency, about the silent epidemic of veteran suicide, about the importance of reaching out to those who had sacrificed so much for their countries. The mood shifted dramatically as people began to understand the deeper significance of what they were witnessing. Jake felt overwhelmed by the support from complete strangers, but also deeply troubled by the comparison to the woman's lost son. He thought of his own dark moments, the times when the pain had seemed unbearable and permanent solutions had whispered seductive promises. William's simple act of recognition and compassion had meant more to him than the British soldier could possibly know. News crews were arriving in greater numbers now, drawn by the social media explosion that was making this story international news. Reporters pushed through the crowd, trying to get closer to the central drama. The incident was being broadcast live on multiple platforms, and public opinion was forming in real time across the globe. The palace supervisors found themselves in an impossible position. Their duty was clear: maintain order, enforce protocol, and protect the institution's reputation. But arresting a soldier for showing compassion to a veteran was becoming a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. The optics were terrible, and getting worse by the minute. A new voice cut through the chaos with unmistakable authority. "What exactly is happening here?" Everyone turned to see a senior military officer approaching, his uniform bearing insignia that marked him as holding significant rank. This was Colonel James Whitfield, commanding officer of the Coldstream Guards, a man whose opinion would carry enormous weight in determining William's fate. The crowd parted respectfully as the colonel approached, his experienced eyes taking in the scene with the rapid assessment skills of a career military officer. He saw his sergeant holding his bearskin hat in a clear breach of protocol, the American veteran whose distress was still evident, the crowd of supporters, and the news cameras capturing every moment. "Sir," William said, coming to attention despite still holding his hat, "I can explain." "I'm sure you can, Sergeant," the colonel replied, his voice giving nothing away. "But first, I'd like to hear from this gentleman." He turned to Jake with the courteous attention due to a fellow serviceman. "Marine, I presume? Would you mind telling me what transpired here?" Jake straightened unconsciously, responding to the authority in the colonel's voice. "Yes, sir, United States Marines. I was having a PTSD episode, and your sergeant here recognized what was happening and provided assistance. He may have saved my life, sir." The colonel's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed a flicker of something. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. "And you felt this assistance required breaking protocol?" "Sergeant Hartwell?" "Yes, sir," William replied without hesitation. "Some duties transcend regulations, sir. I believe assisting a fellow soldier in distress is one of them." The crowd waited for the colonel's response with the kind of tension usually reserved for sporting events or election results. This was the moment that would determine not just William's fate, but what kind of story this would become. Would it be a tale of institutional inflexibility crushing human compassion, or something else entirely? Colonel Whitfield turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your concern and your support for my sergeant. The situation you've witnessed today presents us with a conflict between military protocol and human decency. Such conflicts are never easy to resolve." He paused, and Jake could see the man weighing his words carefully, knowing that whatever he said next would be broadcast around the world and would reflect not just on him, but on the entire British military establishment. "However," the colonel continued, "there are principles that transcend protocol. The welfare of soldiers, the bonds of military brotherhood, and the duty to assist those who have served with honor are among the highest values of any military organization. Sergeant Hartwell's actions today embodied these principles." A cheer began to rise from the crowd, but the colonel raised his hand for silence. He wasn't finished. "At the same time, we cannot simply ignore breaches of protocol, no matter how well-intentioned. The discipline and tradition of the Queen's Guard exist for important reasons, and they cannot be set aside lightly." The crowd's mood sobered again, sensing that William wasn't out of danger yet. Jake stepped forward, driven by a desperate need to protect the man who had risked everything to help him. "Sir, if I may, the fault is entirely mine. I created the situation that required your sergeant's intervention. If there must be consequences, they should fall on me, not him." The colonel regarded Jake with new interest. "That's a generous offer, Marine, but British military discipline is our responsibility, not yours." He turned back to William, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant Hartwell, your actions today were simultaneously a breach of protocol and an exemplary demonstration of military values. Such contradictions require careful consideration." The suspense was becoming unbearable. Media crews jostled for better positions, and the crowd pressed closer, straining to hear every word. Around the world, people were following the story on social media, debates raging about duty versus compassion, rules versus humanity. Behind the colonel, other senior officers had arrived, their faces grave as they assessed the situation. This was no longer just about one sergeant's decision. It had become a test case that would influence how military institutions balanced tradition with human needs. William remained at attention, ready to accept whatever consequence his actions had earned. He had made his choice with full knowledge of the potential cost, and he was prepared to pay it. But as he looked at Jake, saw the gratitude and respect in the Marine's eyes, and heard the support of the crowd around him, he felt no regret. The Colonel's next words would determine whether this story ended in tragedy or triumph, whether institutional rigidity would prevail over human compassion, or whether sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. The entire world, it seemed, was waiting to find out which kind of story this would be. Colonel Whitfield walked closer to William, studying his sergeant's face with the keen eye of someone who had led men through combat and understood the weight of difficult decisions. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness a moment that would define not just these two soldiers, but perhaps influence how society viewed the balance between duty and humanity. "Sergeant Hartwell," the colonel began, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard, "in your 8 years of service, you have maintained an exemplary record. Never once have you failed in your duties, never once have you brought discredit upon the regiment, and never once have you shown anything less than complete dedication to the Crown." William's heart sank. The colonel's words sounded like the prelude to a court-martial, a formal acknowledgement of past service before the hammer fell. He prepared himself for the end of his military career, for the disappointment of his family, for the collapse of everything he had worked toward. "Today," the colonel continued, "you faced a choice between blind adherence to protocol and acting upon the deeper principles that make a soldier truly worthy of the uniform. You chose to assist a brother-in-arms in distress, knowing full well the consequences you might face." Jake watched with growing anxiety, seeing the formal tone that suggested bad news was coming. He had caused this situation, and now a good man was about to pay the price for his kindness. The guilt was almost overwhelming, and Jake found himself wishing he had never come to London, never witnessed the ceremony, never created the circumstances that led to this moment. "In making that choice," the colonel said, his voice growing stronger, "you demonstrated the highest ideals of military service. You showed that true discipline lies not in blind obedience, but in knowing when honor demands that we act beyond the simple requirements of regulation." A murmur ran through the crowd as the colonel's words took an unexpected turn. This didn't sound like the beginning of a punishment. Hope began to flicker in the faces around the courtyard, and social media feeds exploded with speculation about what was coming next. The colonel reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew something that made several of the military personnel present straighten with surprise. It was a commendation medal, the kind typically reserved for acts of exceptional service. "Sergeant William Hartwell, by the authority vested in me as commanding officer of the Coldstream Guards, I hereby commend you for distinguished service above and beyond the call of duty." The crowd erupted in cheers. But the colonel raised his hand for silence once more. He wasn't finished. "However," he continued, causing hearts to skip beats around the courtyard, "we cannot ignore the breach of protocol that occurred here today. Actions have consequences, even when those actions are motivated by the highest principles." The emotional whiplash was almost unbearable. Just when it seemed William would be rewarded for his compassion, the threat of punishment returned. The crowd's cheers died down, replaced by anxious murmurs and the clicking of camera shutters capturing every moment of the drama. "Therefore," the colonel announced, "Sergeant Hartwell will be temporarily reassigned from ceremonial duties to serve as a liaison with veteran support services." His obvious ability to connect with and assist fellow servicemen makes him ideally suited for such work. The genius of the solution was immediately apparent. Rather than punishing William or simply ignoring the breach of protocol, the colonel was turning the situation into an opportunity. William would face consequences for his actions, but they would be consequences that acknowledged the value of what he had done and put his demonstrated skills to good use. William looked stunned, clearly not having expected this outcome. He had been prepared for court-martial, demotion, or dismissal. Instead, he was being given a new role that would allow him to help other veterans while serving his country in a different capacity. "Sir," William said, his voice tight with emotion. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "I know you won't." "Sergeant," the colonel replied with a slight smile. "In fact, I suspect you'll excel in this new role. Your first assignment will be to work with our American friend here, to ensure he receives the support he needs and to serve as a bridge between our respective veteran services." Jake felt overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Not only had William avoided punishment, but Jake himself was being offered help he hadn't even known he needed. The prospect of working with someone who truly understood his struggles, who had faced similar demons and found ways to cope, was more valuable than any traditional therapy session. "Sir," Jake said, stepping forward, "I'd be honored to work with Sergeant Hartwell, and I want to thank you for your understanding of what happened here today." The colonel nodded gravely. "Marine, your service to your country is appreciated, and your struggles are recognized. No soldier should face the aftermath of war alone, and today we've seen a powerful reminder of the bonds that unite all who serve." Around them, the crowd began to disperse, but many lingered, taking photos and talking animatedly about what they had witnessed. The story would continue to spread across social media and traditional news outlets, but now it was a story of redemption and understanding rather than institutional inflexibility. News reporters approached both soldiers, seeking interviews and comments. William and Jake found themselves at the center of a media storm, their simple act of human connection having touched something deep in the public consciousness. They agreed to speak briefly with selected journalists, wanting to use their unexpected platform to highlight the struggles of veterans and the importance of supporting those who had served. "The lesson here," William told one reporter, "is that sometimes doing the right thing requires taking risks, but when it comes to helping a fellow soldier, those risks are worth taking." Jake added his perspective. "What Sergeant Hartwell did today probably saved my life. He recognized someone in crisis and acted, despite the potential cost to himself. That's what real courage looks like." As the immediate media attention began to die down, the two soldiers found themselves walking together through Hyde Park, away from the crowds and cameras. For the first time since the incident began, they had a chance to truly talk, soldier to soldier, about their experiences and their futures. "I still can't believe you risked your career for a stranger," Jake said, as they sat on a bench overlooking the Serpentine. "Why? Really, why did you do it?" William was quiet for a moment, watching ducks glide across the water. "Because I've been where you were today," he finally said. "Standing in that crowd, fighting memories, feeling like you're drowning in plain sight while everyone around you sees just another tourist. I know what it's like to feel that alone. And someone helped you? A Navy SEAL in Afghanistan. I was barely holding it together after losing my entire squad in an IED attack. He sat with me for hours, didn't say much, just made sure I wasn't alone with my thoughts. Never saw him again, but I never forgot what that meant." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two warriors finding peace in shared understanding. Around them, London continued its bustling pace. But for these few moments, they were just two men who had found something valuable in each other's company. "So what happens now?" Jake asked eventually. "Now we work together," William replied. "The colonel wasn't joking about that assignment. There's a lot we can do to help other veterans, both British and American. Your experience combined with mine could make a real difference." Jake nodded, feeling hopeful for the first time in months. "I'd like that. I'd like to think something good could come out of all this." As the sun began to set over London, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the two soldiers made plans for their future collaboration. They would establish a program to help veterans with PTSD, using their story as an example of how reaching out and accepting help could transform lives. The incident at Buckingham Palace had lasted only an hour, but its effects would ripple outward for years to come. William's willingness to break protocol for a fellow soldier, and the institutional wisdom that recognized the deeper value of his actions, had created something powerful. It became a symbol of how military values could evolve while maintaining their core strength, how institutions could be both disciplined and compassionate. Months later, their joint veteran support program was operating in both countries, helping hundreds of soldiers transition back to civilian life and cope with the invisible wounds of war. William and Jake became close friends, their bond forged in that moment of crisis and strengthened through their shared mission. The story of the Marine and the Royal Guard became more than just a viral news story. It became a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in the quiet struggles of everyday life, and that victory is measured not in territory gained, but in lives saved and spirits restored. In the end, William's breach of protocol had led to something far more valuable than any ceremony could provide, a living example of what military service truly means, and proof that the bonds forged in war can continue to save lives long after the fighting ends. Their story showed the world that true strength lies not in rigid adherence to rules, but in the courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything.